Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the University of California Disaster Resilience Network, UCDRN, the UC Berkeley Center for Security and Politics, and the California Council on Science and Technology, or CCST, thank you for joining us for this important and timely discussion. My name is Eric Chu, and I am the Director of Science Services here at CCST. To begin, I want to acknowledge that we are participating today from many different locations across what is now known as the state of California, ancestral lands that have long been stewarded by Indigenous communities since time immemorial. CCST is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization established at the request of the California State Legislature in 1988 to provide science and technology advice to state policymakers. We work to amplify and translate the deep expertise across California's world-class research institutions into actionable insights for decision makers. We do this through expert briefings like the one you're attending today, peer-reviewed reports, and our Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program, which places PhD-level scientists and engineers in government offices for a year of public service and leadership training. Today's webinar is the third event in a year-long series exploring how disasters and climate impacts are shaping where people choose to live and work. Tragic events like the devastating fires across Los Angeles earlier this year have forced all of us to confront the growing human, economic, and environmental toll of disasters, and also to recognize how much more work is needed to build resilience across California and the US. Our panelists today will offer diverse perspectives on how disasters influence decisions to stay in place despite heightened disaster risks or to relocate to safer areas. These decisions raise complex legal, social, and policy challenges, especially as they relate to the movement of people across geographic and political boundaries. To kick us off, I'm very pleased to introduce Secretary Janet Napolitano. She currently serves as the director of the UC Berkeley Institute for Security and Governance and the co-chair of UCDRN. And also, hot off the press, she was recently elected as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. You may also know Secretary Napolitano as the former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, former president of the University of California System, and the former governor of Arizona. While Secretary Napolitano unfortunately could not join us live today, she graciously recorded a short video to share her thoughts on the themes our panelists will explore in greater depth during today's briefing. Now I pass it on to Secretary Napolitano.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janet Napolitano, Director of the Berkeley Institute for Security and Governance, BISG, and co-chair of the UC Disaster Resilience Network, UCDRN. I want to welcome you to the third installment of our year-long series, Climate Change and Human Mobility. Today's session, Human Mobility Across Borders, arrives at a moment when what we discuss here is not just timely, but life-altering for many communities. We're fortunate to have assembled an exceptional panel working at the frontier of climate-driven human movement. Aline Benveniste, Joshua Busby, and Barbara Walter, moderated by our through thread for this series, Doug Parsons of America Adapts. Their insights into the legal, social, and policy dimensions of cross-border mobility are indispensable. It is of no surprise that our stellar panel features a University of Texas talent in Professor Joshua Busby out of their flagship campus in Austin. Another UT talent has taken the helm as UC's new president, James B. Milliken. President Milliken steps in at a pivotal moment. The University of California, the world's most powerful public research university system, is entering one of its most challenging chapters, and there is no better person to advance the mission of the University of California while balancing the values of our society. Now is the absolute moment to come together not just as a bear, a Bruin, a Triton, a banana slug, or a gaucho, but as a proud member of the world's most powerful public research university. As a proud part of this incredible constellation of talent, I lead the Berkeley Institute for Security and Governance within that ecosystem. We advance research, curriculum, and convenings that bring together students, scholars, and practitioners to address critical global risks. One powerful example is the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab, founded and led by Associate Professor Andrew Reddy. At the lab, we conduct rigorous work on cybersecurity, nuclear weapons policy, emerging defense technologies, and wargaming, bridging deep academic research with real-world policy application. At BISG, I'm committed to translating this interdisciplinary research into evidence-based solutions for policymakers and training a diverse generation of security professionals prepared to meet emerging challenges. BISG works closely with UCDRN to support visionary leadership across the system, leadership that understands the compounding disasters and polycrises are just beginning to etch their painful chapter in our collective memories, and that it is all hands on deck to address this existential challenge. Across the UC, our diverse pockets of deep talent can represent one of the most powerful disaster resilience clusters in the world with the proper organization and support. Across the system, UCDRN recognizes both the scale of the challenge before us and the unique opportunity it holds. Now, in its fourth year of standing operations, UCDRN has elevated its collective capacity through teaching and training. With UCOP's visionary UC Online, they've quadrupled their system-wide online offerings in resilience-related fields, even as they gear up to partner with UC ANR and deepen collaboration with the UC Natural Reserve System, all on a march toward a UC-wide disaster resilience studies program and school. Research. UCDRN collaborates with leading research centers across UC, the Research Armada, to generate actionable interdisciplinary knowledge. That includes hubs focused on wildfire resilience, seismic safety through AI, pandemic response, cyber and infrastructure stability, community-based disaster response, fire resilience for vulnerable populations, and One Health planetary health. These examples reflect interdisciplinary reach, action-oriented research, and scalable expertise. And finally, public service partnerships. UCDRN co-develops solutions with agencies, communities, NGOs, and industry, making sure policy and practice move in lockstep with science. It was for these reasons that over a year ago, Director for UCDRN Nicholas Pascal invented CCST and BISG to join in co-designing this series, Climate Change and Human Mobility. We set out to unpack climate's cascading impacts from local displacement to cross-border migration. Today's installment, Human Mobility Across Borders, addresses the legal, social, and policy dilemmas that arise when people must move across national lines under intensifying threat. One more reason this moment feels so pivotal. The state of California's fifth climate change assessment is currently in the oven, scheduled to enter peer review and public feedback in the coming months, with full release by mid-2026. For the first time, the assessment will include thematic foci to spur critical action, including climate-induced migration and displacement both within and across our borders. Researchers from across the UC system, including at campuses UC Berkeley and UC San Diego, are guiding and authoring this effort. In particular, UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center and Othering and Belonging Institute are leading the state's dedicated climate-induced human migration and displacement report. This represents a transformative moment in mobilizing California's scientific leadership to drive the policy changes our communities so urgently need. There may be no issue more foundational to a safe, resilient democracy than how we manage cross-border movement, whether driven by disaster, instability, or climate breakdown. In How Safe Are We? Homeland Security Since 9/11, I argued that our security frameworks must evolve to meet the complex realities of today: climate shocks, pandemics, cyber threats, and mass displacement. And in El Tercer País, San Diego and Tijuana, 2 countries, 2 cities, 1 community, we learn how environmental and socioeconomic ties bind border communities in shared resilience. Thank you all for your partnership, your expertise, and your commitment. As polycrises test our systems and communities, our collective strength, anchored in UC's extraordinary talent, unified behind visionary leadership, and delivered through our benchmarking commitment to advancing education, research, and public serving partnerships, will determine whether we meet this moment with resolve or whether we falter. Last but certainly not least, my sincere thanks to CCST, Eric Chu and his team for their leadership and collaboration in making this series and today possible.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Napolitano, for those thoughtful introductory remarks. I'd also like to echo Secretary Napolitano's thanks to all the dedicated staff at our partner institutions at UCDRN and the UC Berkeley Institute for Security and Governance for making this collaboration throughout this year super valuable. Now, for the next hour onto the main program, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Doug Parsons. Doug is the founder and host of America Adapts podcast, the climate change podcast, one of the world's leading podcasts dedicating to climate adaptation. Through his podcast, Doug has interviewed hundreds of experts, from top scientists and policymakers to grassroots leaders, elevating critical adaptation conversations to a global audience. Before launching America Adapts, Doug built a career in climate adaptation, working in Australia on agricultural climate impacts before becoming Florida's first climate change coordinator, at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. He later served as the climate change liaison for the National Park Service and as North America Policy Director at the Society for Conservation Biology. Now, through America Adapts, Doug continues to amplify the voices of those driving adaptation solutions. Definitely, please check out his podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for moderating this webinar again, Doug, and I pass it on to you.
All right, thank you, Eric, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to moderate this again. Hopefully you've been happy with this. And so this series has been enlightening and fun to moderate. And thanks to those in the audience that are joining us today, there's a big crowd of you there. So while much of this climate-driven migration is expected to happen within regional or jurisdictional bounds, the amount of cross-border and transnational migration will also rise. As climate change accelerates increasingly severe weather events, people are faced with the decision of staying in place or relocating to lower-risk areas. The movement of people, both within and across borders and jurisdictions, is linked to complex legal, social, and policy questions concerning sovereignty, security, land use, community makeup, and equitable provisions of goods and services. That's the purpose here today, to have these tough conversations and to figure out how to prepare for what's next. Now I want to introduce the panel. I'm going to introduce them and say where they're affiliated, and they're going to give us a little bit of background. First up is Dr. Helene Benaviste. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Social Sciences at Stanford University. Next, we have Dr. Joshua Busby from the University of Texas at Austin in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And finally is Dr. Barbara Walter from the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. I'm going to let Helene kick us off and give us a little bit more background. Helene.
Thank you, Doug. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invite. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a professor at Stanford at the Environmental Social Sciences Department. The bulk of my research focuses really on global climate policy, with about half of it that has a really strong focus on global climate migration, which I assume is why I was invited to talk today. In particular, I'm interested both in how we can measure the effects of climate change on existing human movement, as well as what we might think might happen in the future, and so conducting projection exercises of what might happen under increasing conditions of climate change, and I also work on the international governance of the issue. And I'll kick it on to Josh.
Thanks very much. I'm Josh Busby. I'm a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. I've been writing on climate and security for about 2 decades, leading up to my 2022 book, States and Nature, The Effects of Climate Change on Security, which uses paired cases of different countries that face similar exposure to climate hazards, but had very different security outcomes, and including some cases that involve both internal and international migration. And from 2021 to 2023, I served as a senior climate advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense. And perhaps one of the reasons I might have been invited today is I also have a 2023 paper with colleagues on the effects of climate change on Central American migration in the 2010s. I'm going to kick it over to Barbara Walter.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Walter, and my recent research has all been about the rise of political violence, especially in democratic countries and democratic countries that are in decline. You might wonder what that has to do with climate change and migration. But one of the things that we have learned is that changing demographics in the countries of Western Europe, Central Europe, and North America has been a driver of far-right parties and increasing skepticism about democracy and domestic terror, which is overwhelmingly still directed at members of minority groups. So I'm really interested in climate change in terms of how it tends to encourage cross-border migration, and how cross-border migration, what effects it has on democracy across the world. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, guys. What a fantastic panel with expertise there. First off, to the audience, you guys, it's a big group now. And so we are going to take questions from you. Just bear with us. We obviously will get a lot of questions. We can't answer them all, but stick them in there. We'll see what we can get to, and highly encourage that. We're going to kind of kick things off with some questions that I have, but we want to get to audience questions. So take the time and something maybe respond to what you're hearing. All right, Josh, I'm going to let you start this off, and I want to talk like sort of big picture here. How's your understanding of climate and migration changed over time? Seems like a lot of information is kind of accelerating the last 5-10 years.
Yeah, when I first started writing on climate and migration about 15 years ago, as part of the wider work on climate security, there was the sense that most movements of people were internal to short distances from where they were affected by climate hazards. So either within their own countries, locally, and that they were temporary, that people would go and ultimately, if they could, they'd like to return home. And then we've seen over the last 15 years that there has been wider movements of people even undertaking larger cross-border movements. And so some of the examples that are maybe familiar to folks and it often intersects with other hazards or other things that are happening in society. So the Syrian civil war intersected with a very severe drought, and there are questions about what role the drought played in the lead up to the civil war. But the two together drove large numbers of people out of Syria into neighboring countries, most of them in the near abroad, right, to neighboring countries like Lebanon and Turkey. And then you saw wider migration of more limited numbers into Europe, into countries like Germany. So we're starting to see more evidence of wider displacement of people, and trying to ascertain to what extent is that climate driven or driven by other forces is a really tricky challenge, but it's not limited to that particular example of Syria. As I mentioned, I had a 2023 paper on Central American migration, and one of the things that we tried to identify is to what extent was climate change a driver of that movement from Central America to the United States. And one of the interesting things we found is, based on border interdiction data at the U.S. southern border, that we were able to identify where people had, who were caught by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, what were their hometowns, and we were able to assess what the weather conditions had been like in their hometowns before their departure. And we found that hotter and drier than normal conditions were associated with higher levels of migration out of Central America to the United States, even when you control for other factors like localized violence. So that started to shape my wider understanding that we're starting to see these effects show up in cross-border movements, not just within countries, but between countries.
All right, I'm going to jump to Helene here, but for the panelists, if you want to weigh in on a particular question, I guess just raise your hand or something. So if it's a particularly juicy question, let's do that. But Helene, and I hear mainly attribution with climate change. You think about flooding and extreme heat, but so does climate change necessarily increase pre-existing migration, and kind of how do you parse that out?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think the answer there is kind of multifaceted. Definitely, Josh pointed to two of the very important examples where we've been able, his team and the broader literature have been able to trace effects of increasing climate stresses and climate change on increasing cross-border migration. We also have other examples where it's actually the other way around, where existing cross-border migration flows end up being decreased under climate stress. So for instance, a recent study that came out a few years ago about Nepal, so a bit further away from here, where you have communities, smallholder farmer communities that typically would send someone from their family, typically to the Gulf countries, to to bring another source of income, to work in other areas, in other sectors, and then send back some money back home. That type of migration is kind of widespread in a lot of communities around the world. It's also something that tends to require money from families to send someone first in the first place. And what we see in that study, for instance, is that under bad weather conditions, under bad crop conditions in smallholder farmer communities in Nepal, what happens is that type of cross-border migration actually decreases because people don't have the means anymore to start that, sending someone from their family to another place. And so what that means really is that you end up in situations where you have a decreased cross-border migration, but that's something that's not necessarily the illustration of decreased vulnerability to climate stress. Actually, you end up in situations where decreased migration can also mean increased vulnerability to subsequent stress, because those communities then don't have that other source of income that would help them take care of future climate stress where they are. So those two kind of, at first sight, kind of counterintuitive results actually pan out together. And this is kind of one of the challenges of the climate migration work, is to try and parse out in which direction these effects play out in which context.
All right, thanks, Barbara. I'm going to jump to you. So there's this ongoing debate about how climate pressures and migration, separately or together, shape conflict risk. What does the evidence in your field show for this? And Josh mentioned Syria, but what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I'll give you the big picture. So one of the things that we know is that the major form of, or the type of civil war in the 21st century is ethnically based civil wars. That's been increasing over the last 50 years. It didn't used to be how most civil wars were fought, but it's ethnic groups now that tend to be fighting each other. We also know that the groups that tend to start these ethnically based wars are actually the groups in the country or in a region that had once been politically and economically dominant, but are in decline. So how does this connect back to climate change? The countries that were the most ethnically homogeneous in the world, and therefore unlikely to experience a lot of ethnic conflict, were the countries of North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. they were overwhelmingly white. But immigration changed those dynamics most heavily in the United States. And then after that comes Canada, followed by Australia and New Zealand. But immigration has also been changing the demographics of the once stalwart democracies, especially in Western Europe. And so what you see happening is that the once dominant and still dominant white ethnic group here in the United States, but also in Europe, they're reacting the way we have seen once dominant groups react across the world. They feel increasingly threatened, and politicians are exploiting this fear. And so if you look at what happened in Europe, both Central and Western Europe, after the 2015 refugee crisis. And that's when you saw just hundreds of thousands of refugees coming up from the global south, either because of climate crisis or because of war. They made the decision that all of us would make, which is if you can no longer survive in your own country and you're going to have to move, you want to go to a country that not only is relatively wealthy and therefore has services for its citizens, but you want to go to democracies. And so what we saw were big migrations into Europe. And the result was the rise of nationalism across the board and a rise of far-right parties, and then subsequent declines in support for democracy. And one of the things that surveys have shown is that citizens love having lots of social services from their democracy, but they don't like to share it with newcomers. And so if they think their taxes are going to be supporting people who don't look like them and have the same beliefs as they do, then their support for democracy actually declines. So if you think about this in terms of what to expect in the future, the World Bank did a report a number of years ago about what we can expect in terms of migration as a result of global warming. And Josh probably knows, or Helene probably knows the exact numbers, but it was in the, I think, tens of millions of people they expect will be migrating. Most of them are going to come from the global south. Again, they're going to make the decision to try to get into the wealthy democratic countries of the north. And right now, those countries have really no plan in place about how to absorb these migrants and how to protect and strengthen their democracy in the process. Because again, you can expect some subset of the white population in all of these countries to sort of move more towards the racial extreme. And follow individuals who convince them that they have to do everything possible to maintain the identity of their country and to make sure that they remain in charge of what they believe is rightfully theirs.
All right, there's a couple rabbit holes I'd love to go down. Maybe we'll come back to that. But Josh, that overlaps quite a bit with your work. And I would just want you to weigh in on that same question, because you do similar work and just some of the things that Barbara said.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that occurred to me is that in that same story, the movements, to what extent it's climate driven or driven by conflict, that's a really hard thing to disentangle. But when we think about that European migration in the mid 2010s, most of that movement is to the near abroad, to Lebanon and Turkey, who absorbed either several million or several hundred thousand Syrians. And it's a relatively smaller movement to, Germany and other countries. Not insignificant, but pales in comparison. So one of the interesting things is to think about why some country contexts might be more welcoming. And obviously, the European Union did a lot to try to persuade Turkey to house and maintain larger numbers than maybe they otherwise would have wanted. But you see a similar dynamic in, Kenya's embrace, at least for some time, of Somali refugees. So there was a really huge refugee camp, Dadaab, that it's not quite clear if it's any longer, but it was, almost a one of the largest refugee camps in the world, and so you see some of that dynamic playing out. And I want to come back to the point that that Barbara raised, is that the movements of these populations, trying to determine what the cause is, again, really tricky, but those folks are often very vulnerable and marginalized themselves. So when we think about the conflict potential, a lot of the literature basically suggests that and it's really hard to study this, but those folks tend to be marginalized and at great risk personally. And so because of their own precarity, they're less likely to engage in conflict. It's really a lot dependent upon how host communities receive them. It's not so much like, are they prone to conflict themselves? It's whether or not the host countries, feel, some sense of competition with them for resources or services, or that they come from some other group that they don't recognize. And so that I think is bound up in some of these conflict risk potential. And there's another particular kind that we may not associate with migration per se, but it is a longstanding feature of transhumance and pastoralism, the movements, particularly in the Sahel, of seasonal migration of herders who go where the grass and the water are to graze livestock and water them. And that has become more challenging in a world of climate change, in which those groups are now having to go further afield and often coming into conflict with settled farmers who, they're worried about their crops being eaten by the livestock, or that they're competing for water. And that's those flashpoints of farmer herder violence throughout the Sahel, and that band extending across West Africa, across to East Africa, those have become more severe. And it's maybe not super visible to Western audiences, but in this sort of climate conflict space and that kind of migration, it's a very particular kind of violence that is a little bit different from what Barbara was talking about earlier.
Yeah. Doug, can I quickly jump in here?
Sure.
So I think that's an important distinction that Josh is making, that I think there's two ways that large migration can destabilize countries. I talked about the first one, which is they go into established democracies, and the populations in those countries react poorly and start to support a number of sort of uncivil policies. But the other way is what Josh alluded to, which is when you have large movements of refugees into neighboring countries. And those neighboring countries are often not wealthy. They tend to be small. They already are demographically more heterogeneous than the countries of Europe. And studies have consistently shown in political science that large refugee camps of refugees from neighboring countries are at much, much higher risk of civil war, that those camps are destabilizing, not because the individuals who've moved are bad people, but because they become an easy place for extremists to hide. They become a recruitment place for rebels from the neighboring country to recruit into their movement. And so, when countries are unprepared and are unable to handle large migrant flows, it has a whole host of pretty large scale political effects that could lead to violence.
All right, Helene, I want to jump back to you here. And in the United States, adaptation resilience is sort of a different beast than you see in the rest of the world, because we always have to be that way. And so this notion of climate havens, where people might move and migrate toward because they think it's going to be a safe area with climate change and stuff. So do people always end up in places where they are less exposed to climate change from where they came from? I've never really heard internationally.
No, not necessarily. Internationally, honestly, sometimes the biggest constraint to figure out whether people are more or less exposed is really going to be the data constraint. So those types of studies are actually really difficult to carry. This is a boring partial answer, but it's important to acknowledge the data limitations we're facing here. Internally, that's absolutely true that people might move away from environmental stress or environmental harm, but not necessarily either know much about what kind of environmental stress they might face at destination, or just not consider that those stressors are worth, avoiding that destination if that destination is a place where perhaps they have family there already, or perhaps they can't find a job. And actually, there's another recent study on Bangladesh this time that showed this really interesting result, that even in spite of, projected really strong effects of sea level rise in that country that is really very low lying, and about a third of the country is really under threat of sea level rise. It's a highly densely populated country. What they found was that actually you would expect having increasing numbers of people in areas that are going to be exposed to sea level rise rather than decreasing, because people end up moving to cities where they can find job prospects. And many of those places are actually in places that are very exposed to sea level rise. So the point being, you want to take into account the vulnerability that people might find themselves into at destination. And that's not necessarily something that first we can measure well, or second that people even themselves take into account when they make the decision to migrate. And the last point I want to mention is just to clarify that the reference that Barbara very rightly pointed to on the World Bank study. So that's the Groundswell report series that was strictly focused on within country migration. And my understanding is that the World Bank now is working on future cross-border migration projections as well.
All right, great. Josh, did you want to hop in there?
Yeah, I was just, that there was a well-known statistic from Norman Myers that circulated some years ago that was projecting, it's a kind of absurd number of like 250 million, or it's a really large number, but it was sort of, kind of just extrapolated out of thin air and came under for a lot of criticism. And so we don't really have good ways of getting at what the likely numbers will be. And a lot of it may not be determined by the physical properties of the world and the willingness of people to want to leave. It may be determined more by politics and the policies of whether or not there is much human mobility, which is a kind of story of human history of the movements of people. But as nation states established stricter border controls, that I think more people would probably move around between and within countries if they could, but the mobility may be constrained. But I did want to think about this question of people move out of harm's way into harm's way. And one of the interesting features, for example, of transborder migration is after Hurricane Mitch in 1998, there were temporary protected status was offered to some limited number of migrants from Honduras and Nicaragua, which actually persisted up until the Trump administration. So you had people moving to the United States. They were legally able to reside in the U.S. for some period of time. You also had something similar happen, not climate related, but after the earthquake struck Haiti in 2010. Again, those protections were recently removed by the Trump administration. But people may have moved from Central America and then ended up in Houston or in Florida, and then found themselves, at risk of, and it's kind of the similar story that you had after Hurricane Katrina, where you had large numbers of people leave New Orleans and move to Houston, and then maybe had to flee again after Hurricane Harvey. So you have, people go most of the time, to join friends and family where they already have social ties, and those social ties may be in places themselves that are highly exposed to climate risks.
I'd mentioned the term climate haven, and I was actually thinking of doing an episode in Asheville, North Carolina, because it was considered a climate haven, water, mountainous, nowhere near the coast. And then, Hurricane Helene changed all that, and the definition of what a haven, I think Racine, Wisconsin right now is like so far the safe spot. All right, Barbara, I want to jump back to you. And you are an expert in civil wars, and you have a book published called How Civil Wars Start. And has climate change already played a role in any of these civil wars? I know we talked a bit about Syria, and are there other examples of that where you can just sort of point directly at it as a catalyst for that?
Well, my short answer is I'm sure it has. And Syria's a case that people talk about a lot because of the drought in eastern Syria, and President Assad's unwillingness to actually help the Syrians who were living in that area because they were Sunnis, and they were not part of his base of support. That revealed how corrupt he was, and it motivated a lot of Sunnis who were previously pretty passive about their government to begin to protest. We know that the Arab Spring was in part due to climate factors, climate leading to increased dissatisfaction, leading to increased protests. And then a lot of it has to do with how the government then responds to those protesters. If it cracks down really harshly, that could escalate into a war, as it did in Libya. If the protests are successful and the leader leaves, like Mubarak did in Egypt, you actually get a pretty good outcome. I haven't looked specifically at the data. Josh probably knows what studies have been done on this more recently. But the data on ethnic conflict and who starts it, and the really, really big role that changing demographics play in incentivizing these groups to turn to violence is really strong. And again, when you think about what's going to drive demographics in the upcoming decades, it's going to be the movement of people, and they're going to be moving in large part because of climate change. So it's extrapolating from the existing studies we have about the important role changing demographics play, but it's not hard to see the connection between climate change and migration and changing demographics.
And let's stick with non-controversial subjects like civil wars. And I think about the United States, and typically we think of civil wars, and if climate change is going to be a catalyst, drought, movement of people, you think of these climate impacts that could potentially drive civil war. But I think about the United States and, the climate denial. Could that actually be a source of a civil war? Because this group of people's like, this is a really serious threat. This group of people says it's not a threat. We need you to take care of this threat. And do you see, it's just right now, it's just a lot of rhetoric when it's not that like that in the United States, but at some point, the urgency of this issue, because we hear that a lot. Climate change is this serious, urgent issue.
Yeah.
Is denial going to be a driver in those kind of conversations?
I don't think so, Doug, because civil wars aren't really driven by particular issues. In the 60s and 70s, it was driven by ideology, but these were big ideologies. Are you a communist? Are you not a communist? Are you a Maoist? Not a Maoist? Like, are you? That's what drives people, and underlying that, of course, are deep grievances against the way the current government is being run. If a country becomes polarized on issues, are you pro-vaccine, vaccinations or anti-vaccinations? I mean, that doesn't drive people to pick up guns and start shooting each other. What I could see happen, and it's interesting that I wanted to think more about what Helene said, that much of the migration that we see is within countries. And Josh also said this. Like, imagine and I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now. So here in the United States, there are states that are much more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than others. That's Florida and parts of the southern coast, the southeast coast. It's California with fires. And so you can see an exodus from those states. And what are the political ramifications of that? It's really actually pretty interesting. If California starts to empty out, or the coastal California starts to empty out because of continuous wildfires, they're going to go to less blue states, making them more blue in the process. You see it already with people leaving California to go to Idaho and Utah and Nevada and Arizona because it's cheaper there, making those states less conservative in the process. But then you have the countervailing force of Florida, maybe people leaving and going, maybe that won't have the same big effect. They'll be going to moving north, which are many states which are heavily red. So maybe that doesn't have a big effect. So, do I see climate denial leading to conflict here in the United States per se? No, but I think if we continue to deny climate change and we take no actions, or we actually scale back what we've been doing so far, climate change, the effects of climate change are going to be greater, and more people are going to migrate, and that in itself is going to be disruptive.
I'm originally from Florida. I'm in Arizona right now, and the people that come to Florida but don't want to go all the way back to New York, Ohio, we call them halfbacks. They go to North Carolina or South Carolina. So it's a thing. And there's a question here. I'm not going to jump between the audience questions, but I want to go, Helene, I've got my next question for you. But then Diane Zagara says, this is a fantastic conversation. Do we have any data on where Native Californians are leaving to groundwater issues, drought issues? And you, Barbara, you just mentioned that.
We absolutely do. If you just Google where are people from California moving, you'll get really great visuals and data, and they have a very good idea of where we're going. We're generally going to places with a lower cost of living.
And we, people in Arizona, thank you, Californians, for coming, making us a purple state. Thank you for that. But you're driving up real estate. Okay. Helene, putting you on the spot a little bit here. So most countries have national adaptation plans, and they're actually required in some contexts to have these. The US, again, only we don't really have one. And so are they factoring in migration within and out of borders? Are they useful documents in the sense of migration and climate migration?
And please, Josh, weigh on this as well if you feel like I'm not telling the full story. My understanding is that not really. The national adaptation plans that you're mentioning are those that are typically requested as part of the international negotiations on climate change. And as part of that, migration is not really part of the adaptation conversation, strictly speaking, as part of the UN climate change negotiations. What migration is put into so far is in this very new thing that is called loss and damage, which is kind of this third pillar of the climate change regime that was created a decade ago now in the Paris Agreement in 2015. There is not a super clear implementation strategy so far about what dealing with climate migration is supposed to look like as part of, managing climate change overall. Some countries have been very proactive in mentioning migration, both within their own borders and to other countries as part of their national adaptation plans. And if I'm not mistaken, Bangladesh is one of those. And the small island developing states typically also mention some form of relocation as part of their national adaptation plans. But that's not something that's systematized at all. And I think you're pointing to what I think is a relative gap in how governments are thinking about climate migration at the global level so far. In my view, and again, happy to have other panelists weigh in, it's not an issue that is, sufficiently covered by national governments as part of international work.
Did Josh or Barbara, do you have anything to say about the national adaptation plans? Any experience with those?
No.
Yeah, not so much. I mean, I think most of those efforts are directed towards internal adaptation and not with an eye towards what might be transnational migration into those countries. That may come up in other processes. But I did want to come back to something that Barbara raised about prospects for civil war in the U.S. related to climate change, and I agree with her that I think that's unlikely. But it reminded me of the literature on disasters and authoritarian regimes, that disasters can pose a threat to the survival of authoritarians. And so if there are particular shocks like an earthquake and an authoritarian leader responds poorly, it can lead to regime turnover in terms of, it could be contestation inside the elite leadership that then leads to that leader being pushed out. And so, even in the democratic context of the U.S. Up until the recent period, there have been notable failures in terms of the critique, that was levied against George W. Bush after Hurricane Katrina, or you can even think about the response by the previous Trump administration to Hurricane Maria, that there are groups that are often not served well after particular extreme weather events, and that is consistent with historic marginalization. Now that may not materialize in terms of violence. We see it in other country contexts, but that's not to say that it won't show up in the future if there are severe episodes of extreme climate distress and the US government doesn't respond well to them. And one of the things that the literature has said is that the climate signal compared to other drivers of violence has been quite limited, at least heretofore. And there was a terrific sort of um, uh, expert elicitation study that was led by Catherine Mock that I think came out in, it was either Nature or Science. And the experts, all who are scholars of Civil War, all said, we think the climate signal is a small part. There are other drivers like the ones that Barbara mentioned earlier in terms of ethnic differences and others, government state capacity, things like that. But given that climate change is likely accelerating in the future, the impact may increase. And so I think there are a couple of things going on here that we need to be mindful of. And so even if the climate driver of conflict to date has been limited, that doesn't tell us very much.
We kind of lost you there at the end, Josh. Barbara, I want to jump to you, and I might have two questions for you because this is a quick question from Avatar Binding, but this is, I think, more current events. What helped, I guess, make the recent changes in the ruling classes in Nepal and Bangladesh? Was climate change, or was it something else with some of those conflicts? Are you aware at all with those issues? It's kind of putting you on the spot there.
Oh, you know what? I have not been following them carefully, so I don't want to say anything. I know that Bangladesh has had to deal with climate disasters for most of its history, and that Bengalis have moved cross border into Myanmar and into India, and this has led to conflict in both of those cases from the local population. Probably the most famous one is the genocide against the Rohingya, perpetrated by the Myanmar government, just in the last decade. I don't know specifically if that is the result of climate change. I know that, the Bengalis have been moving for economic opportunities. Yeah, so I'll just say I really don't know much more than that. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're getting to very interesting questions, and I've kind of moved over to the audience questions. And Helene, this is a question for you, and this is interesting. You might all have an informed opinion on this, but you mentioned impacts on migration from climate change in the U.S. Displacement has resulted in increased houselessness. I guess homelessness would be that part of that too, for those who lose their homes and cannot afford to rebuild or even to rent. Might this reduce the cross-border migration? I guess addressing homelessness, and I get the international situation is probably much different domestic, but they're sort of approaching, I guess, the housing stock and such. Would that sort of be a solution even in an international context, if I'm interpreting that right?
Yes, so let me make sure I'm understanding the question. The point being, addressing houselessness or homelessness would be a way to avoid migration driven by environmental stressors. Is that the question?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, this is pointing to one aspect that I think the overall conversation has shown so far is that climate migration is not really just climate migration. I mean, addressing climate migration requires a whole set of policies that are not specifically just about climate migration, and housing policy is definitely one type of relevant policy there, because obviously what has been coming out of this conversation is that people rarely strictly move just because of the climate thing that's going on. They move because they know someone else that might help them somewhere, or they move because their home has been destroyed and they can't stay exactly where they are. There are like other components of it. And so if policies are put in place to address at least some of those components that would change the incentives and the ability of people to make those migration decisions, certainly. That's definitely the case for housing. It's also the case for any really urban planning policies, design of infrastructure, making sure that, in urban centers that might, be the destinations of various groups of migrants, having infrastructures that, in terms of water, sewage, or whatnot, that can just, account for those changes in population plays a huge difference in how those changes are lived, both by the incoming migrant communities as well as by the host communities as well.
All right, Josh, I'm jumping back to you, and this is another regional question. So climate change has been described as a dire threat for low-lying nations, particularly in the Pacific, obviously. So what are some of the options available to these communities facing these risks, and how's the international community responded? And my own experience with that, I was able to interview a senator from Marshallese Island, and she gave us a presentation and such, and apparently they're kind of giving up on the Marshall Islands, that it's probably going to be completely swamped. And they're looking at moving to Arkansas. And there's a population there right now. And that is the solution here. It's not an inspiring one, but that's the sort of things that they're thinking about. What else are you hearing out there? There's a lot of islands out there.
Yeah, that's a great question. Can you hear me okay
Yep.
on your end? Yeah. So the Marshall Islands is really a special case because we have in the U.S. a compact of free association with them where they're entitled to live and work in the U.S. and the U.S. provides security for them, and we have really important military assets there in Kwajalein Atoll. But the atolls at atoll-like countries like the Marshall Islands are especially vulnerable because of their geologic features that they're at risk of overtopping from sea level rise, and even before that, salinization of the water supply could become an issue. So it'll be very challenging for them to be able to have clean water. And so there are other countries like them, like Kiribati, Tuvalu, Maldives, who are like that. And so, one of the former Kiribati leaders, Note Tong, purchased land from his government in Fiji, perhaps with an idea of relocation, but also maybe with an idea of food production there. It's a little unclear, and some of those policies have been rolled back. But one of the challenges is if they ideally would like to stay in place, is there adaptation that's affordable that they can, with the support of the international community, make the lives and livelihoods of their populace, as many of them as possible, viable? And I think that's an open question for a lot of these low-lying island countries. And then there are other migration policies that could be passed, either seasonal or permanent migration to neighbors. Like New Zealand experimented with a humanitarian visa in 2017 that was sort of identified as the kind of climate change migrant visa that was discontinued because it seemed to make it sound like it was hopeless in those countries. So the other Pacific Island countries didn't quite like it because they thought it diminished the international community's willingness to support adaptation in situ. But the reality is that some places in those countries may become unlivable, and you'll probably heard of the problem of managed retreat, that there'll be particular communities, if not the entire countries, that they're going to have to pick up and move and go to higher ground or go across border, maybe Fiji or other places, or New Zealand if they'll have them. And that's not something that the international community's worked out at all. And if, in frankness, probably won't, given that the whole asylum regime associated with political refugee movements is under complete stress and shambles at the moment. And so it's hard to imagine expanding the legal openness outside a few bilateral contexts to allow climate migrants, even if you were able to define them clearly as being climate migrants and not much else, that we're just not in a position right now, given the politics of the world, to kind of expand the legal protections for the movements of peoples, because the main ones of political asylum are under extreme threat.
All right, so we have about 10 more minutes here, so not a lot of time for questions, but this obviously California is hosting this event. We have mainly people from California listening in, and I want to ask some questions related to that. And Barbara, to you, and maybe Helene, you want to weigh in on this because you're both there in California. What kind of sort of coursework, when students and even people want to get more grounding in these kind of things, where are some of the shortcomings? Because we think of the organizers, they are really thinking about there's a lot of work going on here, but are there any sort of shortcomings, what sort of, if there's areas of study that probably need to be beefed up, what would you say, I guess, in the California system?
Well, that's a hard question, Doug.
Well,
I'll take it from a slightly different angle, since the literature that I look at is about the effects of demographic changes on conflict, with climate migration changing demographics. And what's so interesting about California to me in that context is that California went through this big demographic change from a majority white state to a minority white state. It was the first. It went through that. Now the United States is going through that, where it will become minority white by around 2045. The U.S. will be the first white majority country in the world to go through this, but it's going to be followed by all the others eventually. And when you think about the question of how does a big multi-ethnic country navigate that transition in a peaceful way, California offers this really, really good case study on what we can expect and how to potentially navigate it, and where you end up. If you guys all probably were alive to remember Pete Wilson. So Pete Wilson was a Republican governor who came to power by arguing that by basically going after immigrants in the state of California. And he instituted and passed a series of harsh laws against immigrants, most of whom were Mexican. This was when California was going through this transition. This is still when whites dominated California, but we were reaching a tipping point, and power was gonna switch. And this was a popular strategy, and it worked for Pete Wilson in the short term. So there was a lot of anger and contestation during this transition. It brought Pete Wilson to power. And then whites became a minority. And Pete Wilson and people like him were arguing this is doom and gloom for California. California's, its economy is going to be destroyed. All these terrible effects were going to happen. And of course, none of those negative predictions came true. And in fact, California not only thrived, but increasingly thrived over time as a white minority state. And so what you see is, yes, you can expect turmoil as you're moving through this transition, as demographics change. But this argument that life is going to get significantly worse for everybody as a result, especially the once dominant population, is simply a lie and a tool that self-serving politicians often use to gain a base of white support. So California is a really, really nice case study for the effects of demographic change and how it can actually lead to an even more vibrant, even more economically prosperous situation.
Look to California. Helene, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that. I had another question from the audience I'd like to get to, though. But did you have any sort of saying there at Stanford that
Very brief, just on the demands of students. That's not something that I've seen that's necessarily specific to California, including at other institutions I was at previously. There is really strong increasing demand of students for courses on climate-related migration issues, like to an extent that is even surprising to me, even though I work on this. So that's something that we're starting to put together at Stanford. Yeah.
I'm going to stick with you, Helene. This question that came in from Sylvia Ham is there evidence that U.S.-funded development programs in Latin America, implemented through the previous U.S. government, State Department, and USAID, have effectively reduced migration to the United States? Have you seen any statistics like that these programs is a cause and effect to that?
Yeah, so that's not a literature that I've directly contributed to, so I'm going to speak under the control of my panelists as well. My sense, and that's based on one of the meta-analyses that was published recently on the effectiveness of those types of policies, is that in quite a few cases, actually, if those types of development aid don't necessarily have the effect of reducing migration, because you want to think of migration as not just people wanting to move away, but also people having the ability to pay the cost of moving away. And if some of those policies are helping people also get into better economic conditions, some populations, some households also decide to use those better economic conditions provided by policies to use them as resources, including for migrating. So it's not necessarily the case that a household or a community under stress getting more resources. It depends a lot on how you frame the resources. And that's the way you frame the resources is going to have an effect quite a bit on whether the migration decision is being taken or not. But again, I want to make the point there that this is if you think in a framing of changing migration numbers as being the outcome variable. If you think of the framing of improving well-being of populations as being the outcome variable, then the migration is one element of it, and it's gonna improve or reduce well-being of both migrant communities, home communities, and destination communities. But that's going to be a medium and not necessarily the end goal.
Can I jump in, Doug?
Of course.
So there's really great research in part on this question from a guy named Gordon Hanson, who's at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And I think he's focused on Latin America in general, but for sure he's focused on Mexico. And this question of, can you reverse migration by bolstering the economic health of countries that are sending migrants to the United States? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes, that much of this migration, or at least in the time period that he was looking at, is economically driven. People are moving because they're looking for a better life for them and their families. Most people don't want to move if they could make a decent living in their home countries. They would much prefer to stay there. And he actually found that when Mexico began to develop and their economy began to improve, immigration into the United States declined significantly to the point where certainly in the 2000s and probably into the 2010s, we saw more Mexicans moving back to Mexico than were coming here. So again, they're coming here because they can't make a decent living in their home countries. And if the United States could pursue policies that improve the economy of those countries, more people would prefer to stay in their home countries.
Josh, did you want to jump in?
To follow up on that, yeah, the sort of regional integration in the Americas was probably helpful for Mexico's economic success in that regard.
Yeah.
And it's a little challenging to imagine that small amounts of aid to Central America would necessarily do the same thing without a wider integration strategy. And one of the challenges is that smallholder agriculture, which may be, areas that are perhaps sending large numbers of people, that may be increasingly a challenging source of livelihoods. And so the kinds of foreign assistance policies wouldn't simply be about, assisting countries in agriculture, but might mean building up other sources of livelihood, like small scale manufacturing, and what that looks like. It could be, I don't know, clothing or other kinds of sources of economic development. But that's if Americans were worried about large numbers of people coming, then the right answer ultimately would be help those countries have sources of livelihood, because as Barbara suggested, people want to stay in their communities. But it also might mean more seasonal migration, guest worker permits to allow people to come and go more freely, so they don't have to make the choice of I go forever, and I cut ties and don't go back because I can't get back into the country once I leave, or have something where they come and go more freely. And so they may go 6 months of the year, and that satisfies both countries' concerns. One needs economic development, and one needs workers to work, particularly in really challenging areas where, native-born populations may be disinclined to pick the fruit or do meat packing or what have you.
All right, we actually have a couple minutes, but you guys just ended that, I think, perfectly. All three of you just weighed in. And so I'm just going to make a judgment call. And Eric, I'm going to get you back on here. And to close this out with a couple minutes to spare, I want to thank the panelists for coming on. Fantastic conversation. I get to interview experts like you for my podcast. And it was a treat to interview all three of you. And especially want to thank the audience members for contributing and for listening into what we're doing here today. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks. Thank you, Josh. Thanks, Helene, Barbara, for this wonderful conversation. As you may know, the topic is not what CCST we're used to covering. I mean, our charge is to cover complex topics in intelligent and evidence-based ways. And so, tackling these really complex, difficult current events topics in a situated context is often challenging. And I appreciate, the insights, diversity of backgrounds and expertise that you're bringing to this conversation. I hope that the panelists and the audience really appreciated the conversation. I also want to thank Doug for moderating this third time, and also to UCDRN and the Berkeley Institute for Security and Governance for everyone's support. A final note to the audience: a recording of this entire conversation will be available on our website, and so everyone can revisit it or share it with colleagues. We also invite all of us to join us in future expert briefings hosted by CCST and our partners. So stay tuned for those announcements. And those will come soon. And if you sign up for CCST's newsletter on ccst.us, you won't miss any of these updates. Again, appreciation to everyone, panelists and moderator alike. And we hope that everyone has a great day. Thank you so much again.